Hi, I'm Pete May, President of GreenBiz Group, and I'm here with Joan Barminski, the Regional Director for the Pacific region of the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. So, Joan, that may not be a household word for everybody. Tell us, what does the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management do, and what do you do there?
Sure, Pete. The Bureau of Ocean Energy Management is a very small agency. We're part of the Interior Department, U.S. government, and we have the responsibility for offshore energy. And that includes the leasing of federal lands, ocean side, of course, for oil and gas, renewable energy, and then marine minerals. So we have a three-part purview. But we're here today really talking about the renewable energy side of things.
Yeah, and I wanted to ask you about that because pardon the bad pun, but it seems like there's been kind of a sea change in what's happened in offshore wind in the last couple years. Seems like there's quite an insurgence. Tell us, do I have that right? And what's driving that?
Well, there are several things really that are driving it. One was in 2005, the Energy Policy Act was enacted by Congress. And that authorized BOEM, to Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, to pursue offshore renewable energy development. So we got the responsibility for the leasing and for the permitting, as in review of plans, and the NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act analyses to allow that to all move forward. And there was a lot of interest in the country in pursuing that. Particularly on the East Coast, which was the first first mover in that regard. And where are some of those projects? Where's been most of the activity? There are leases offshore about, well, I'm not sure the number of states, but there are 11 leases that have been issued. But they are primarily in the New England, from Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Delaware, Maryland.
Interesting.
New Jersey. So there's some those, and North Carolina.
And so talk a little bit more about what do you think is fueling this, and what are some of the hurdles to implementation?
Fueling it is the, I'd say state interest in the energy resource that they can harvest from offshore their coast.
That it's a really efficient and large-scale renewable source.
Yes. It would bring in energy that they don't have locally, and the fact that there's available space offshore provides that, the location for the wind. Whereas onshore, land is constrained in terms of availability and suitability for the wind. So it's a good spot.
Interesting. And give us a little compare and contrast opportunities for offshore wind. Hawaii, West Coast, East Coast.
Okay. It does sort of progress from the East Coast having been the first place where things are developing. The projects aren't built yet, but they're in the permitting process in a number of cases, so they're going to be there probably first. And there is one in state waters off Rhode Island, on Block Island. So that is really great. The West Coast and Hawaii both are in relatively the same position in terms of in the planning stage for wind. So there's a lot of interest in the state through the Energy Commission in California, some through HECO and other managers of the energy portfolio, plus the RPS, the renewable portfolio standards that California and Hawaii have are tremendous. And those really are driving the interest in adding offshore wind as a component of reaching that. Solar voltaics are really important in both states and are really serving to add to the value or reaching those RPSs. But there seems to be a real consensus that offshore wind can provide a big, another part, kind of diversification, as well as a substantial volume.
And talk a little bit about, we don't have time to go too much in depth, but some of the technology, floating versus fixed, and where those are playing out.
And that is another big difference between the East Coast and then the West Coast Pacific areas. East Coast is bottom-founded structures at this point. It has a large continental shelf that's relatively wide and relatively shallow enough to do the bottom fixed. But on the West Coast and Hawaii, there's a very precipitous drop in water depth, or increase in water depth close to shore. So you get into deep water very fast, and the opportunity for putting in a bottom-founded structure is relatively limited.
Got it.
So everyone is looking now at the floating. That's another reason why the West Coast, Hawaii areas are following a little bit in the US, because the technology is being developed now for the floating.
Yeah.
The fixed foundations have been in place in Europe and other countries already well established, but now we have some floating facilities that have been put into the water. Offshore Scotland is one, the High Wind project, and then offshore Portugal, there's another one. So these different technologies are being developed. And
Interesting. Well, this is a fascinating subject. Joan Barminski, it's been great to have you. I wish, this is really interesting to see this sector emerge as a big component of renewable energy. Thanks for joining us today.
You're really welcome. Thank you.